Many of you were involved as the 4 basin roundtables have come together to look at what that risk is and what the risk of failure is. But how great a risk is that? One of the things that the 4 basin roundtables collectively decided was they wanted to be better informed about what the possibilities are, what the consequences are, but exactly how big an issue is this that we're going to be talking about for the rest of the day. They commissioned a study that we've simply called the risk study to try to evaluate what that looks like, what it means if that 2002 drought starts again instead of starting with nearly full reservoirs statewide and interstate. The big reservoirs were nearly full when we went through that record-setting drought. What happens if we do that again starting at 30 and 40, just below 50% of full on those reservoirs that we rely on for the management and operations of the river? So to continue the banquet, we have Eric Kuhn. Eric, as all of you know, a recently retired general manager for the Colorado River District, still very much a part of the River District team and an integral and guiding partner in the risk study process. One other item at the end of Eric's conversation and the others, we will have opportunity for question and answer, and we will have, if you'll just raise your hand, I think the lights aren't too bright this time here. I think I can see you, and people, more importantly, people in the back with microphones can see you, and they'll rush up and hand you a microphone from which you can ask your question. Eric?
Well, thank you and good morning. I can say that my time at the River District, I never accomplished this. I never had as many people in the room. So Andy, you've already exceeded my record, and you're doing a really great job. And I want to again thank the River District staff that I worked with for those many years. I love you all, and we have some interesting challenges in front of us. And my obligation and my commitment to the River District is, even in my retirement, is to continue to be a positive force in helping move us towards solutions that we can all accept. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the risk study, but also one of the major reasons we really did the risk study, John McLeod's in the audience and he recognized this, was to begin a discussion about how the river operates. We often in the water business assume we all have this detailed understanding, and very few of us do, including me. So it really is helpful. The biggest real advantage to me in the risk study was we've really educated a lot of people on how the Colorado River operates. And that was, to me, still one of the primary objectives of this study, is so people understand how the river operates and what the issues are. Let's see here. So the next thing I want to talk about, my overview is, first I'm going to talk about how the river's operated and managed. This is the big river. Second, why did we conduct a risk study? And third, what are the results and the implications for the future? Of course, here's the Colorado River Basin. Just a few real quick facts about the Colorado River Basin. It's about 250, drainage area is about 250,000 square miles, plus or minus. That's about the same as the Columbia River Basin, which drains of parts of Canada and Idaho, Montana, Oregon, Washington, flows into the Pacific there at Astoria, Oregon. It has a flow of over 200 million acre feet per year at the mouth. The Colorado River has a flow of 0 at the mouth because we use it all. If we weren't using any of it, that natural flow might be about 14 or 15 million acre feet. So for these 2 basins in the west that have about the same drainage area, the Columbia River has almost, 15 times or 14, 15 times as much water. And the reason that the Colorado is such a small river compared to its drainage area, of course, is that most of the river is really desert, high desert. with maybe 15% of the lands above 9,000 feet that provide about 95% of the runoff. And where are most of those high mountain watersheds? They're in the Colorado River District and in the Southwest. Colorado contributes over 70% of the natural flow of the river because that's where the mountains are. Wyoming and Utah also make significant contributions. New Mexico, almost nothing. Nevada, nothing. Arizona, California, nothing. And Arizona has one major tributary. The largest tributary is the Gila River. But the Gila River, in most years, although it has a couple million acre-feet as it flows out of the Mogollon Rim, because it passes through desert, by the time it would get to Yuma, it's nothing. So the river, because of the geography, what this river has done is means that every drop is important, every drop is used. And they understood that, as Russ said 100 years ago. Colorado River Compact, of course, Russ mentioned it. Why did we have a compact? Well, we had a compact, quite frankly, because there was inequality within the basin states at the time. California was growing very fast. California had a need for water for flood control, had a need for water for irrigation, had a need for water to produce hydroelectric power. The other states feared that if prior appropriation, first in time, first in right, would be applied on an interstate basis, we would all, our futures would go down the river to those senior rights in California. And I think Carpenter, 100 years later, has shown to be really on point on that. So the prior appropriation doctrine, despite its divine sort of thoughts here in Colorado, was not a good model for the interstate allocation of water. And the purpose of the compact was to avoid the appropriation doctrine. It was so that the states would not be subject to the appropriation doctrine, as the Supreme Court decreed on a small river in northern Colorado called the Laramie, which runs north into Wyoming. In Wyoming versus Colorado, the United States Supreme Court said is where you have states that have prior appropriation doctrines. Prior appropriation as applied on interstate streams is appropriate. So we wanted to avoid that, and we did. So the basin is divided into an upper basin and a lower basin. That was a natural division, primarily based on geography and needs. The lower basin had 12 months a year growing seasons, a large need for the water. It has a different geography. The upper basin had canyons, it had mountains, it produced most of the water, but it also had limitations because the growing season in the upper basin goes from anywhere from 60 days to maybe 6 months down here in the Grand Junction area, or 6 or 7 months. Under the compact, and this is really important, this is the stuff we need to really understand and think about as things go forward. There are certain obligations. Although Delph Carpenter called them a flow guarantee, the attorneys for the state don't like. They've kind of put Delph Carpenter in the back of their mind and said no, he really wasn't right, even though he wrote the thing. Is that the upper basin has a couple obligations at Lee Ferry, the dividing point, just below Glen Canyon Dam. First is 75 million acre-feet non-depletion over any 10 consecutive years. And the second is a disputed and so far undefined, in the upper basin's eyes anyway, obligation to Mexico under the 1944 treaty. Now in 1922, when they put together the compact, there was no treaty with Mexico, but every commissioner in the room and every advisor to every commissioner in the room that was negotiated the compact knew there would be a Mexican treaty. In fact, the State Department actually recommended in 1919 that we negotiate an interstate agreement with Mexico before the compact was negotiated on the states. That couldn't happen because of a revolution in Mexico and an unstable government in Mexico. So the idea that Mexico is something that came along later isn't really true. Mexico was at the top of everyone's minds when they were negotiating the compact. They had to put in provision 3C, which meant that in the event of a compact or a treaty, what were the basin's obligations? And it's pretty clear. The water would first come from a surplus. If there was no surplus, then each basin had an obligation to provide half of whatever amount would be delivered to Mexico. That amount is 1.5 million acre feet. Divide 1.5 by half, it's 750,000. Add that to 75 divided by 10, which is 7.5 million. You get 8.25 million acre feet. Subtract a little river called the Paria, which delivers 20,000. And we have a normal release from Glen Canyon Dam of 8.23 million acre feet. That's called a minimum objective release. That has been in place since 1970. So nearly 15 years of that operation. So now I'll quickly go through the 48 Compact, but what did the 48 Compact do? The 48 Compact is subservient to the 22 Compact. It can't change it. It basically, the first sentence in the Compact is that this is subject to the 22 Compact. And what it did is it allocated the upper basin's portion of the upper basin's water that was apportioned to it under the 22 Compact among 5 states, the 4 states of the upper division plus Arizona. Arizona has a little piece of the upper basin in the Page area. And it apportioned, or it allocated the deliveries if there was a shortage. The other thing, in my view, and I'm speaking more of an historian, not as a district representative on this, is the intent of the 48 Compact was to avoid a compact problem. It was to be proactive. It was the intent was to never have a problem. And they understood that they needed to take action ahead of time. So the compact was not designed to, let's go in the hole and let's go out and collect a little water from everybody to get back to where we belong. The compact, the purpose of the compact was to never go in a hole to begin with. But under that compact, Arizona gets 50,000 acre feet straight across the board. Arizona has no obligation at Lee Ferry. It's a quirk of the 22 Compact, but it's real. Colorado gets a little over half of the water that's apportioned to the upper basin, 51.75%. That was a tough sale, by the way, in 1948 when Clifford Stone had to bring this back, because we all, the legislators all knew that Colorado contributed about 72% of the upper basin's water. We were only going to get to use 52%, and they had to do some dancing, quite frankly, to get that through the state legislature when it came to ratification of the 48 Compact. They ultimately did, and it was in fact unanimous, but it was an issue that has been with us a long time. So let's next talk about river operations. This is where I want to spend a little time, because you really need to understand river operations before we can understand the results, or the need for and the results of our risk study. The law of the river, the 22 Compact, the 48 Compact, the treaty, the Boulder Canyon Project Act, Arizona v. California decrees, and so on, those are the guides. But in operating these large reservoirs, there are many, many, many details that aren't discussed. There's Lake Mead and Powell didn't exist in 1922 when they were negotiating the compact, although they first saw the need for it. The compact, in Carpenter's view, defined rights and obligations. It was not an implementation document. California wanted to put the construction of what is now Hoover Dam in the compact, and Delph Carpenter and his Upper Basin folks refused to do that because they saw it as a legal agreement, not as an implementation agreement. That was one of the major sources of friction between the basins, was how to handle storage. So the question is river operations. There are many details that are not in the compacts or the law of the river. There are many details where there are conflicting views, not just between the upper basin and lower basin, but between different states in each division. So the Secretary of the Interior, as the water master in the lower basin and as the owner of these big reservoirs upstream, has some tough decisions. The 1968 Act, which authorized the Central Arizona Project, among other things, requires the Secretary of the Interior to prepare what we call long-range coordinated operating criteria, LROC for short, and annual operating plans. Now, the law provides that the secretary must consult with governor's representatives of each state. That governor's representative is normally the Upper Colorado River Commission. It doesn't have to be. They can be split. But Eric Millis is here from Utah. He is the governor's representative from Utah and its commissioner to the UCRC. But so the secretary must formally consult with the states in preparing these long-range plans and annual operating plans. And that's what gives the states some influence. But it also means that if California says X, Arizona Y, and Colorado Z, the secretary has a problem because the secretary must make a final decision. Now, the way the river developed was, for the first 20 years or so, from 1960s into early 1980s, Lake Powell was filling. We were under filling criteria. We then went into a period where the long-range, the LROC, the long-range coordinated operating plans controlled, and you released a lot of water if there was plenty of water in the system, or you released a minimum objective release of 823 if there wasn't. That worked, but it really didn't work for full development. And in the late 1990s, really led by Ken Salazar, Jim Lockhead, and others, and Pat Mulroy from Nevada, they realized that there needed to be more specifics. The states and the secretary had to develop more detailed plans. They couldn't let some of these long festering disputes linger. So the purpose of the 2007 interim guidelines were to define the shortages. When would the lower basin states have to have a shortage under the 1964 decree? And two, a coordinated operation of Lake Mead and Lake Powell. So when we say, what controls the operation of the river? Yes, it is the compact, but the details are really in the 2007 interim guidelines, and the state of Colorado, Governor Owens, it was one of the last things he did in December of 2006, agreed, along with the other 6 states, to those interim guidelines, which was quite an achievement by Scott Balcom, Jim Lockhead, and others at the time to reach a consensus among 7 states. Now, it was interim. It expires in 2026 because we wanted to make sure that, that we tried this out. There were a lot of new things that we're doing. It was breaking new ground. So we want to make it long enough that we could gain experience, but not make it forever. So these interim guidelines will have to be renegotiated in 2026. Really important. So here's Lake Powell. I don't want to go through this quickly, but why are we leasing 9 million acre feet in water year 2018 and water year 2019, which will begin in just a couple weeks on October 1st, 2018? We're releasing 9 million acre feet because supply, the reservoir levels in Powell and Mead dictate a 9 million acre foot release under the interim guidelines that we as a state of Colorado accepted. And Secretary Kempthorne approved, recognizing that all the states agreed to this. So that's why we're doing 9 million. Well, why is that a bonus to the lower basin? Yes and no. It helps in the lower basin. It's a good thing for the lower basin, but it's not a bonus because it was always intended that this was the way it would operate. And two, in a couple years, if low flows continue, we're going to be releasing under these guidelines 748. So the idea was it's 823 is the fulcrum. In some years we'll release 9, in some years 748, and they will about even themselves out over a long period of time. Now that was based on a little more optimistic hydrology. Since 2000, we've seen much lower hydrology, and that has sort of tilted the teeter-totter in the lower basin's favor. But that remains to be seen, and that's going to have to be addressed in the renegotiations. So why did we do a risk study? We did a risk study because the fact that the basin has seen full development as a basin as a whole. Now, many believe, and I'm one of them, that the lower basin has a little overdeveloped and the upper basin is a little underdeveloped, but that's That's a perspective that comes along with the geography of living in the upper basin. If you're in the lower basin, you may not agree with that. And to the very low hydrology we've seen since 2000. The upper division states planning, which we're talking about in these contingency planning, included a new concept, something that Delph Carpenter, Clifford Stone, and many others really never spent more than 5 minutes thinking about if they thought about it at all. That's demand management. What is demand management? It's a fancy way of saying we're going to have to reduce our consumptive uses somewhere in the system in order to reduce the overall demands on the river so that we continue, if the low hydrology continues, then we cannot drain the system. When you build these big reservoirs, you've got to have something in the reserve. You've got to have a little bit of water in the bank. You've got to have a little money in the bank if you're operating a business or an agency or even a household. And that's what this system does. We're not going to bankrupt the system. We're going to have to figure out ways to cut back before we go bankrupt. And that's what demand management is. So the upper division states, we're talking about it. No state has implemented it yet, but we're talking about it. And the Colorado's water plan, point 4 of the framework, also includes the concept of demand management. The framework, which I had a lot to do with, is basically a discussion guide. It's an agenda. And point 4 basically says we're going to take proactive actions to protect existing uses to comply with what I thought was the intent of the 48 Act, which we will not get in a hole that we will have to dig ourselves out of. We will proactively meet our compact obligations. And a way to do that is to always have some water in reservoirs, something in the bank, some amount of reserve. Now, you've seen this graph many times. This changes based on whether the starting conditions are higher or lower. The starting conditions here are for Lake Powell, but you can see the red line is, if we were to have a repeat of the 2000 to 2005 drought with current demands, current levels of operations, we would essentially drain Lake Powell. It would go down to nothing. We can't allow that to happen. So how are we going to fix that? The contingency planning had 3 elements: augmentation. The second is drought response of the CRSP reservoirs. That's those upstream: Flaming Gorge, Blue Mesa, Navajo. That was their primary purpose. It's not well known, but in 1959, the Secretary of Interior had a hard time getting to a benefit to cost ratio that exceeded 1 at Blue Mesa on power alone, or the Aspinall unit. So what did they do? They looked at what would be the contribution of this reservoir for compact purposes, and they assigned a value to that. And by doing that, they kicked the benefit to cost ratio above 1, and Congress said, go ahead and build it. So that was the economic justification report. It's an interesting document, but you might think this risk study is new, but they were doing the very same thing back in the 50s when they were evaluating this project. So contingency planning is drought DCP, drought contingency planning. The lower basin has one, the upper basin has one. They're integrated in terms of they each help each other. The 3 components are drought responses of CRSP reservoirs, augmentation, and, quote, demand management. And we wanted to know on the West Slope, when, how often, and by how much might we have to implement demand management, because that's real cutbacks. That's the time you have real tough decisions to make. Someone's going to have to use less water, and to do that is not going to be easy. So I'll just simply go through some of the West Slope Basin Roundtable study issues. How much, I'll go number 2 here, is how much of the shortages can be covered through the drought response operations? And the answer is about 2 million acre feet. Most of that's in Flaming Gorge, quite frankly, because it's the biggest of those 4 and it has the most inflow. How much consumptive use reductions might we have to plan for? Well, if we were to have another 1950s drought or another 2000 to 2004 drought, the answer is big. It's over 1 million acre feet. So we're going to use those upper basin reservoirs. We're going to assume the lower basin implements its DCP, and we're still going to have to come up with over 1 million acre feet of cutbacks. One of the results of the study is we're not going to do that in 1 year. So the only way we can really do that in a way that makes sense is put a little bit of water into a reserve, into a storage reserve, maybe 50, 100,000 acre feet a year, and then have it available. And that's why storage in Powell for demand management purposes has become such an important issue to the upper basin. Now, it doesn't have to be Powell, it can be other reservoirs, but Powell is the most obvious one. It's got the most space in it. That's where all the water goes. So ultimately, it's going to be Powell and maybe some other upper basin reservoirs, but we need storage in order to implement demand management. That was one of the critical findings of our study. Now, here's some of the critical assumptions. I'll just say we're going to take action at elevation 3525. Full at Powell is 3,700 to protect minimum power, which is 3,490. We're going to take action. That gives us a 2 million acre foot cushion above minimum power. 2 million acre feet in a 25 million acre foot reservoir is not a lot. That's like Denver saying we're going to preserve 20,000 acre feet as a cushion in a 250,000 acre foot Dillon reservoir. If you had that, if your city had a 25,000 acre foot reservoir that it relied on and you're going to hold a reserve of 2,000, people wouldn't think you're all that conservative. So 2 million acre feet is a big number, but when the error in the forecast can be up to 2 million acre feet, you know, it's really not that big a cushion. We're also going to assume the lower basin will successfully implement its drought contingency plan. It'll be reducing its demands by over 1 million acre feet if it needs to based on mead levels. And we're also going to assume that assuming that future hydrology will be similar to 1988 to 2018, that had a natural flow, that's a virgin flow, at Leaf Area of about 13.2 million acre feet. However, since 2000, it's about 12.4. What really concerns me is there's been some recent science that's it's pretty straightforward. It's stuff that they could have done in the 1930s, I think, if they wanted to, which is as temperatures keep going up in this basin, stream flows are going to go down. Precipitation might go up, precipitation might go down, but temperatures really, really impact this river in terms of flows. And we're really seeing that a drought like the 1950s, which was a precipitation drought, if that were to occur again, we're going to see flows lower than what we've seen in the last 18 years. So conclusions, hydrology, demands, future development matter, contingency planning is essential. Some demand management volumes, rare but still real, 2000 to 2004, a 1950s drought. You need a lot of water. You need to have a demand management plan that will provide 500,000 to 1 million acre feet, and you need to put a little bit in each year to do that. You can't do it in 1 year. So demand management, water banking have become integrated. And points to consider, Phase 3, which the district is doing, along with the Southwest District and others. Phase 3 is going to look at some details. Phase 1 and Phase 2 are big picture. We can't answer a whole lot of questions about what it means to individual basins like the Gunnison or the Yampa, but Phase 3 is going to get into using the state's really good modeling capabilities for internal to the state, how it works. The DCPs, the Lower Basin DCP has not been approved yet. Arizona, they're still fighting like cats and dogs over it. And the Lower Basin needs to implement its DCP so the system works in harmony. The 2007 interim guidelines will expire. They technically expire on December 31st, 2025, but they cover water year 2026. So for operations purposes, they're good through September 30th, 2026. They're new guidelines, new operations, that has to be renegotiated, and they will impact DCPs. The DCPs are designed to work in coordination with what we have in place today. You change the ground rules, you're going to have to change the DCPs. And finally, it appears, I think the Lower Basin is now interested to see if Colby agrees with this, but it looks like to be federal legislation directing the Secretary to operate the system in accordance with the DCPs will be necessary. So with that, Chris, I'm hoping to catch up on time and see if we have any time for questions.
Questions? Raise a hand, we'll get a microphone to you.
Thank you, Eric, for all of your work. I have a question about the evaporation impact and the risk study, and what were the assumptions about temperature, because we've had higher temperatures and we know that every degree makes a very large difference in terms of evaporation. So I'm just wondering, are we up to date with the risk study in terms of evaporative impacts?
The question is, are we up to date with the risk study of the evaporative impacts? The answer is we're as close as we can be, because we've used the last 30 years or so. So the last 30 years look closer to what we think the next 25 or 30 years will be than the entire, say, the 1906 to 2018 record. But we'll never get that exactly right. Temperature impacts on stream flows is really, really complicated. It's just not evaporation. It's really evapotranspiration by native and other vegetation. And it is a very complicated subject. And it's why we need to be conservative in looking at our hydrology.
Hi there. I was wondering, is there any part of the study that will look at like alternative hydrologies, like some downscaled climate projections?
We actually, I shortened this, but we've looked at climate change based on CMIP3. The Bureau of Reclamation is trying to put together some later, more up-to-date numbers. They're having a real hard time with the downscaling and the hydrology model. Taking these big, big models that are really good, that appear to be fairly good on climate change, and then converting that with the complex topography we have to stream flows is really complicated. But we did use the same information that we had in the basin study, and we've looked at paleo as well. When I say that, we've looked at paleo back to the last 600 or years. Now, one thing I want to really caution you is when you look at the paleo, there are 19, 20-year droughts that are much drier than what we've seen since 2000. It's sort of a myth. I think it's a good talking point that this is the worst drought in history. It's really not. It's really not even close, if you believe the tree ring record. But we've looked at all of those, and the answer is the same. You need to be prepared for demand management. Is it do you have to do it every 20 years, every 30 years, every 10? Those answers different, but the bottom line is you need to be prepared to do it under all different hydrologic assumptions we take.
Mr. Kuhn, first I'd like to ask if there's anyone else from Wyoming in the room. Good.
The Wyoming caucus is here.
Yes. Can you address, I think it was part of the drought contingency plan, the 2 million acre feet from Flaming Gorge Reservoir, and the effect, if any, of transbasin diversions from the Green or from Flaming Gorge in Wyoming, and the effect those may have on that plan?
The question is to talk about Flaming Gorge. There were 4 initial units of CRSP. Lake Powell, of course, which is the biggest at 25 million acre feet. Flaming Gorge is 4 million acre feet. It's one of the biggest reservoirs the Bureau of Reclamation built. I mean, it's on par with Shasta and lots of other big reservoirs. Then there's Navajo, which is about 1.7 million acre, let's say 2 million acre feet, and the Aspinall unit at about 1 million. All of those reservoirs were built for the same purpose, which is meeting our obligations at Lee Ferry. We've never had to use them for that purpose. Now, Flaming Gorge, what we're seeing is that if there's a shortage, that if we have to move water downstream, there's a lot of capacity in Flaming Gorge because it's that big. It's close to 4 million acre feet of capacity, but there are some restrictions on it into how much it could be used. So it's the way I look at using those upstream reservoirs. It's buying us a year or two in a drought, but if the hydrology doesn't turn around, then it's just buying us a couple of years. Then we have to kick in demand management. As to Trans Mountain diversions out of the Flaming Gorge, I just see them as a pipe dream. I can't see anyone on the Front Range spending that kind of money with that kind of uncertainty to build a pipeline that if you straightened it out would go to Omaha, Nebraska from Denver. Again, I'm just being candid. I think it's crazy.
Eric, thank you for a very nice talk. My name is John Weisheit. I'm from Moab, Utah. You just answered part of my question. So I'm thinking about the record of decisions for the Gunnison, the San Juan, and the Green River, and I'm kind of thinking about the letter that Rick Gold wrote to the Upper Colorado River Commission about, for example, how it would be hard to meet the goals of the record of decision for the Green River. He felt that the Upper Colorado River Commission should understand that only 165,000 acre feet could be released from Flaming Gorge Dam in any given year. I think this is, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that was about the Flaming Gorge pipeline that Aaron Million wanted to build. So thanks. That's the end of my question.
Yeah, and there was at most that 150,000, 160,000 for a Flaming Gorge pipeline, and they hadn't even considered at the time how Flaming Gorge might be used to meet all of the the lower basin obligations. But what we found is the records of decision for the Aspinall Unit, Navajo, and Flaming Gorge have a certain amount of flexibility in them. And that 2 million acre feet, I said, that is available to supplement Lake Powell would assume they're operating under those records of decision. So there's really a lot of flexibility in how we operate those reservoirs for power generation. And quite frankly, most people are asking for more flows in dry years. So if you're on the green, the fact that you might be in a higher tier for releases during the summer to supplement Lake Powell is actually going to be a benefit to many of the fishermen and the rafters downstream. Recreation, it's on the reservoir, there's a trade-off there.
One more.
So you had said that the 2 million acre feet is kind of our trigger point when we're protecting minimum power pool in Powell, and we can do that with the CRSSP reservoirs, but then there also is the need for additional demand management beyond that. Could you just explain that a little bit more, how that all?
Well, what I said is our goal is to protect minimum power, which is 3490. We're going to start taking action if it looks like it would go below 3525, which is a 2 million acre feet between the two. So that 2 million just happens to be about the same amount of water that's available in the upstream reservoirs. It was just an accident that way. So the two numbers are the same, but what we found is in a drought like 2000 to 2004, you use your upstream reservoir operations and you still have dry years and you got to turn to demand management. You need some storage reserve, if you want to call it, for those really dry 1950s and 2000 to 2004 kind of droughts, because we will have used our upstream storage reservoir and we still have a need for it at Lake Powell. And that's, in a drought like 2012, 2013, the 1980s to early 90s, you can use the upstream reservoirs and then nature recovers. And you don't have to go to demand management. But for those really dry droughts, you've got to turn to demand management. You have to be ready to do demand management. It's one thing to use it, it's another to be ready. And we really have to be ready for it.
One more, last one here.
Hi, Eric. Thank you for your talk. And I thought it was really interesting what you said about demand management and that we need storage and augmentation. And I've heard about some projects going on regarding fallowing here in the Grand Valley to try to push some water to Powell. And I was curious what other ideas or projects are going on regarding banking and storing that reduced demand.
Well, we need to that's what, Phase 3 and other things are going to look at that in more detail, but, there's opportunities to do it in Blue Mesa, the Aspinall unit. There may be opportunities to do it in Flaming Gorge on certain years for conservation above Flaming Gorge. So, it's going to be a package. I think Powell is the most logical place, but Powell has its disadvantages right now. Powell is subject to the most evaporation. It's the warmest, lowest elevation, warmest space. So, those are the trade-offs, and those are the details that the states and the districts and the UCRC and the Bureau of Reclamation are going to have to get in and really look into them in detail.